So, when we created the program, we thought, well, we can't only do internet politics and censorship and digital policy, but coming to Thessaloniki and being from Berlin, we really also have to speak about Europe and the European dream that we are living in a free and connected and prosperous and digital and all this Europe and all these dreams we have if you think about connecting this whole continent together. And so we thought about coming to Greece, coming to Thessaloniki. We thought about DM25 and we thought about European alternatives because we are all for alternatives in Europe and not only for looking into established politics. And so for starting the discussion and to bring a lot of controversial ideas here and not only saying, well, this is the current politics and this is how it is. We invited Lorenzo Marsili coming from Italy here to give our keynote for you at Republica Thessaloniki. So please join me on stage. Good to be here, finally.
Good to see you.
So we quickly changed the slides, so just a few seconds. And after the keynote, we will have maybe a few minutes still for the break, for maybe one question, and then we will start the full program also on other stages. So I'm very happy that you're all here. And now I hand over to Lorenzo Marsili with Citizens of Nowhere. Thank you. You can use also this.
Thank you, Sandra. You know, we're in Thessaloniki. I'm also a Southern European, and we need to walk around when we speak. And we're restless creatures by design, I dare say. I'm really delighted to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. Repubblica, res publica, of course, is a concept that is closely connected to two ideas that I want to discuss about tonight, a bit informally, a bit improvising. I haven't prepared something that I will read out because it's late and everybody, I think, needs a bit of a surprise when I forget what I want to say. Two concepts that I really want to touch on tonight, which are democracy and Europe. And as you can imagine, those are two concepts that are quite closely connected to Greece, both in the sense that Greece is where the idea and the ideal of democracy, and in fact, the idea and the ideal of Europe, of Europa, have first emerged, and also in the sense that Greece is the place where the idea and the ideal of democracy, and I dare say the idea and the ideal of Europe itself, have also most recently been crushed in the spring and summer of 2015, and I think you all know what I refer to. So it's interesting to be here and to reconnect the meaning of words such as democracy and Europe in the country that invented them and saw them denied. What I think is interesting about the origin of the word Europe is that, as you know, it comes from a Greek myth, the myth of Europa, and we all know that the story is that the beautiful Europa was kidnapped by Zeus, who wanted to make love to her, and Bull transformed himself into a bull, went taking Europa and rode away with Europa on his back. What happens after is that the three brothers of Europa set out to go and try to rescue their sister, to go and try to find Europa. And what they do is that they settle in three different directions. One brother goes towards what today we would call Europe or Western Europe. Another brother goes towards the Middle East or Asia. Another brother goes towards Libya, North Africa. And there is this sense that Europe is always somewhere else and is not a geographically bound concept in this search for Europa that the three brothers set out to take. But there's also something in this search. None of the brothers ever actually found Europa. She's nowhere to be found, but something happens on the way on the way of the search of Europa. One brother, for instance, founds the city of Thebes, and Thebes is one of the most important cities, as you know, for Greek tragedy, and hence it's one of the most important cities for European, Western, and indeed global culture. And what this means is that Europe is not something that is geographically given, because the three brothers set out in very different directions. Europe is always somewhere else. It's always a melting pot. It's always a place of meeting and interaction. And also, Europe is never something that is definitely found, but Europe is that which happens in the process of looking for Europa. Europe is the founding of the city of Thebes, while one brother is trying to find where Europa really is. And so this idea of Europe as a concept in motion, as a concept that has to be constantly interrogated and redefined, I think it's a very important definition of Europe, in particular in today's highly polarized, highly critical political situation. As a matter of fact, also democracy has this constant concept of change inbuilt. Democracy is a system whereby the guiding principles of society can be constantly interrogated and transcended. There is no established democracy. The idea of an establishment or an establishedness is completely contrary to the very idea of democracy, which is a little bit like the search for Europa, a constant journey, a constant quest. And so with those two concepts in mind, Europa and democracy as a place of movement, as a place of change, I want to really, I don't know how to do PowerPoint, so I'm just going to put some quotes there. I want to start by telling you a little bit what I do. I spent the last 10 years of my life really going around all the European space, understood as a space that goes well beyond the confines, the borders of the European Union, to try and argue a little bit like an evangelist that we need to build a real, genuine transnational political space, a genuine transnational democracy, that we need to recuperate our political agency over our continent. And while there is a lot of Europe in this and in all that I've been doing, it's I think an interesting story to share that my fascination for Europe actually began in China, where I was living in 2005, 2006, 2007 for a different life that I was conducting at the time. And clearly when you look at Europe from China, you see the folly of the national division between nation states that are not even the size of an average Chinese city. And you find the complete provincialization or becoming periphery of the whole ensemble of European nation states. We speak a lot about core and periphery, but seen from the rest of the world, as somebody once said, Europe is really divided between states that are too small to have a say in the future and states that are too small to have a say but don't know that yet. And so this was really, quite clearly the original aspiration to try and come back into something that would rejuvenate, re-energize, reconnect our continent, also in the context of change. That's why I wanted to start with the idea of Europa and democracy being a constant process of change, a constant quest. Because what you find in China is that you are immersed in a society that is in a complete process of disruption. Here, perhaps only the Silicon Valley has been disruptive, but in China, the whole society is a gigantic process and element of disruption. I remember very clearly one evening, just before leaving, in fact, China, at a goodbye party of a friend of mine who is called Chen Chen, and this is a quote from her. And Chen Chen was a journalist. She was very young. She was 23, 24 at the time, and she was given a fantastic job. She was going to become the CCTV journalist from Europe, reporting from London on European affairs, and CCTV is the Chinese national television. We heard a lot about television a few moments ago. It is an extraordinary career step for somebody so young, leaving China, going to London, being the face of Chinese reporting from the European Union. And she threw a goodbye party, and at that party she was actually devastated. She appeared sad. She appeared the complete opposite of what I was expecting, given such a fantastic career step. And so I asked her, but how come? Why are you sad? Why aren't you jumping around for the incredible opportunity that you have in front of you? And what she answered me will always remain with me. She said, I will have to stay in Europe at least 5 years. And when I will have come back to China in 5 years' time, everything here will have changed. The society will not be anything that I can recognize. The people who count, the vocabulary that is going to be used won't be one that I will be able to recognize. I will feel like a stranger in my own country. But this is something that you cannot understand because you're European, and in Europe, nothing ever changes. And This exchange was in roughly the summer of 2008. Beijing was hosting the Olympics, and just a month later, Lehman Brothers would collapse in New York. And suddenly change would actually come to the West quite rapidly and quite significantly. What we know that's been happening until that time, 2008, is that somehow history has returned, and it's returned with quite a vengeance. Chen saying that Europe was an immobile space where nothing ever changes was correct, at least when it comes to Western Europe. Of course, if you are from the Balkans or if you are from Eastern Europe, it's a pretty different experience you've had of the 1990s. But if you come from Western Europe, the period that roughly starts from the 80s, when everybody suddenly becomes neoliberal. We all agree that Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan have found the only economic system that can possibly work, and we need to privatize everything we've got. We need to give a complete free rein to finance. We need to shrink the role of the state in the economy, so on and so forth, becomes the dominant dogma of pretty much every political party, every political space, left or right. As you know, in the 1990s, it was the Democrats with Bill Clinton to destroy any last financial supervision over the banking, over the speculation, the possibility of the banks to use your money in order to speculate in the stock exchange, which dated back to Roosevelt and the Great Recession. In Europe, it was mostly the socialists, from Tony Blair to Schroeder to Massimo D'Alema in Italy, even Zapatero in Spain to an extent, that passed labor precarization measures, privatization measures. There was really a world in that period of the 90s, early 2000s, where it seemed that, as you know, Fukuyama was right. History had ended. There is only one way forward. It is financial, neoliberal, market-based capitalism. That illusion has been exhausted with 2008, or at least it's been proven to be just that, just an illusion that has created a system where, as we now increasingly know, inequalities have skyrocketed. The 0.1% globally has accumulated and frankly scandalous amount of wealth. It's created a system where the financial and the banking sector can blackmail the real economy and the industrial sector. It's created a political space that is now imploding in our very hands. And there has been, in this sense, a very strong acceleration of history from 2008 until today. This is very clear in the economic sphere, but I don't need to tell you that this is even more the case in the technological sphere and in the questions that have to do with technology, innovation, digitalization, that I will get to shortly. What I find peculiar is that while history has accelerated for Europe in particular, for the West, for North America, from 2008 until today, this restarting of history, this acceleration of change, hasn't been met at all by an equally strong acceleration or self-questioning of politics. In fact, if you think that something should radically change the moment that your illusions become exhausted, the answer that you would normally get is a quote from Franz Kafka. We all agree it's going to be a fantastic Monday, but Sunday will never end. Things will stay as they are. You know that now we all, obviously and rightly so, miss Barack Obama. I mean, we have like Donald Trump in the White House, even one of the fish that are swimming in the sea just outside would do a better president than Donald Trump. So obviously Barack Obama is direly missed. But it's quite easy to remark that the kind of disruptive political response that was given by another president in the 1930s, when another great recession happened, Roosevelt, following the great crash of 1929, has not really been materialized in the Obama presidency following an equally great crash, that of 2007-2008. As you know, in 1929, the Great Recession ensued. Steinbeck wrote The Grapes of Wrath. There was a period that was in many respects similar to that which we are inhabiting today. We all complain about the superpower of financial institutions, but it was in the 30s that Brecht was writing words that sounded a bit like If you think it's a crime to rob a bank, then how do you call founding one? So there was a problem with finance, there was a problem with banking, there was a problem with skyrocketing inequalities, and there was a problem with monopoly capitalism, something that we see coming back from the Silicon Valley today. I'm going to get to that in a second. But what we also saw in those years was that democracy managed to reconfigure itself, because democracy is something that changes. Democracy is something that constantly interrogates itself. And what Roosevelt managed to do in the 30s was to completely turn the kind of laissez-faire American capitalism of the early 20th century upside down, inventing social security, widespread social security, reimagining the intervention of the state in the economy, putting a nation back to work, restarting the economy, and ultimately saving capitalism and perhaps also American democracy from itself through a substantial transformation of its premises. What we really haven't been able to do instead in the same period in the 1930s in Europe, and a very different historical development followed. Like Roosevelt, Obama was faced with a historic opportunity of transforming the significance, the meaning of neoliberal, or as Nobel Prize Joseph Stiglitz calls it, market fundamentalist capitalism in 2008. Great majority in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, a great boost bottom up to change a system that was rigged in favor of the financial powers that be, so on and so forth. But we haven't seen that transformation of the American, or indeed the Western economy in any respect similar or comparable to what we experienced back in the 30s when Roosevelt inaugurated the era of the New Deal. A very similar story can be told about Europe, even more so. In all these years, since the crisis in Europe has been even more accentuated than it has been in the United States, in particular if you are from the south or the eastern part, or the southeastern part of this continent, or if you come from Ireland, where you just were a few days ago, as a matter of fact. And despite a crisis of extraordinary significance, and despite an extraordinarily lively civil society base that all around Europe was promoting and presenting and debating real economic, political, social alternatives, from a way of handling the economy differently to unemployment schemes, investment schemes. Despite this vitality, despite this gigantic crisis, we haven't seen any capacity of the European system to innovate, reinvent itself throughout the crisis years. This is true if you are, like me, perhaps a little bit adverse to the crisis management that the European nation states have taken in the last 10 years of time. But this is also true if you are a very liberal establishment figure who believes, as the founding fathers of the Euro did back in the early 90s, that in a moment of crisis, Europe had to make a step forwards towards political integration, towards sharing of political and economic risks and benefits. If you were Kohl, for instance, if you were the former German Chancellor, you would be quite scandalized that after 10 years of crisis, we have not managed to have an equally powerful change of the European political space that even vaguely matched the extraordinary economic and social changes that were happening on the ground, economically and socially, in our continent. And so what we see is really a gap in temporality. On the one hand, history accelerating. On the one hand, change coming back with a vengeance to our continent, economic crisis, financial crisis, Ukraine crisis, migration crisis, and on and on and on. Chen being proved completely wrong all of a sudden. Europe becoming one of the most exciting, even if negatively so, spaces globally. And on the other, a politics that remain stuck, a politics that remains in stasis, a politics that says, yes, change will come, but it's still Sunday. In this contrast, in this gap of temporalities, it's really where we find, I think, the most significant explanation for the so-called populist insurgency or authoritarian, nationalist, xenophobic derive of our time. This is something that a good friend of mine from the 1920s used to call the interregnum, as you will know. That moment in history where an old system has died, where the illusions have been and yet a new system is not yet able to arise, is not yet able to be to be born. And it is in this moment that monsters, morbid symptoms appear. We find all around us, as you know, an increasing wave of authoritarian, xenophobic, nationalist movements and parties. And the ground in which they operate is precisely this synchronic space of a history returned, a history that demands a reconfiguration of our political and economic deal, our political and economic system, and instead a politics that tries to keep the status quo as it is, that keeps to continue business as usual. And this frustration, this resentment, this incapacity of having realistically a vision for change is one very powerful brewing ground for the so-called anti-systemic derive and protests and, in fact, governments, such as the Polish or the Hungarian government, that we're now faced with. Now, the question that I want to get to is, how do you get out of this? How do you get out of a situation where history is back, change is on the move again, politics isn't? How do we solve this problem? What many are clearly, as you know, increasingly speaking about is that we need to recuperate a social dimension. We need to recuperate a political space that some people call left-wing populism. To put it very simply, we need more Podemoses, we need more Corbyns, we need more Bernie Sanders in order to bring back to politics what over the 90s and the 2000s has always been lacking, which is an alternative that is there in the political agora and gives you a chance of being neither for the status quo nor for a nationalist retrenchment or a trip back to the 1930s. This is something that it's very important and it's very necessary that materializes, undoubtedly. The Sanders and the Corbyns and the Podemoses, whatever one might think of them individually or politically, are a necessary democratic antidote to this flattening out of a politics that can only perpetuate an unsustainable and frankly deeply unjust status quo. But the message that I want to send tonight to you is that this is not enough. This is important, it's necessary, but as you say in philosophy, it's a necessary but insufficient condition. Because the world has moved on also when it comes to the space where politics is exercised. This is something that another friend of mine, less than Antonio Gramsci, knows very well. When she became Prime Minister, Theresa May said famously, if you believe you're a citizen of the world, you are really a citizen of nowhere. What she was doing was to, well, you know, she had to get the votes from the UKIP nationalists. She had to say the only way of being a real citizen, a real British man or woman, is for you to feel a deep attachment to your nationhood, your nationality. She didn't clarify whether she referred to the English or the Scottish or the Welsh or the Irish nationality. You need to forego any attachment that you may have to the world or, in fact, Europe. Because where politics happens, where citizenship is exercised, is the national space. Clearly, this is it's a very opportunistic claim for Theresa May to make. But if you misread the argument that she makes, she's correct. Now, she doesn't know it, and she's not correct in the way that she means it, but she's correct in the exact opposite way. Because we've reached such a level of interconnectivity with everybody else's business, with everybody else's elections, with everybody else's economic, political, and social spaces, that unless we manage to find a way of exercising political agency at a level that goes beyond the space of the nation state, well, in fact, yes, we will be citizens of nowhere. Because increasingly many decisions that affect us on a daily basis, and especially the most important decisions that will guide our future, happen at a space that goes beyond the borders, the boundaries, the reach of currently existing national states, in particular in the European Union, where states are either too small to influence the future or too small to influence the future, but in denial about that fact. And so Theresa May is right to the extent that there is a lack of citizenship involved. There is a lack of political agency that we are experiencing, But paradoxically, the way to recuperate that political agency is not to go back to the nation state, is not to go back down to our nativist, xenophobic, wall and borders selves, but is to upgrade our political system to a brave new world that is changing very, very fast in front of our eyes, and increasingly so, especially in this part of the world, since 2008. Now, the false dichotomy that Theresa May is giving you is that either you stick to the status quo, neoliberal globalization with an establishment of unaccountable cosmopolitans that are accumulating capital in offshore fiscal havens and don't care about the plights of the common man and woman in Britain. Either you stick to this, which paradoxically the Conservative Party is completely part of, or you go back to a national retrenchment. You put the borders around you. And what you see increasingly in this false choice is that the first space, the space of precisely the neoliberal elites that have created the system that is condemning an increasing share of our population to, frankly, misery, are now pretending to be nationalists and xenophobes in order to keep a hold over power by aping the sentiment that their incapacity to restructure the system is triggering. So the establishment continues with business as usual. This causes a demand to disrupt the system, to turn it upside down. This demand takes increasingly nationalist and xenophobic guises, and the establishment itself pretends to be the response to the problem that it itself has caused. And of course, Donald Trump is one of the most clear examples of this vibe. I think we need to be able to do better. We need to be able to break from the false choice between status quo or national retrenchment. Once upon a time, you know, there was Tina, there is no alternative. Now there are only bad alternatives. Keep what you've got or go back to something that looks like a postmodern version of the 1930s. Trying to undo this false choice, trying to break away from this forced dichotomy is also the way that we can recuperate political agency over what will actually go on to define the future that we are going to inhabit. There are some great, important, fundamental challenges that very clearly escape either of the two sides of the false dichotomy that Theresa May presents us with, status quo globalization or national retrenchment. One of them, you know very well, is technology. It's not true that there is no choice. It's not true that you must use Google or Amazon or Facebook. You can use Baidu, Renren, Tencent. There is a choice. You can choose whether your data gets mined and monetized by Silicon Valley, or it gets mined and monetized by Shenzhen and Beijing. You can choose whether your data gets surveilled and given to the National Security Agency in Washington, or whether it gets surveilled and given to the Chinese Communist Party in Beijing. Again, we have choices, but the problem is that just like globalization, they're equally bad or equally worse, as Lenin, not as much a friend of mine as Gramsci, used to say. The future that we're looking at and that we will be discussing over the coming day risks being a future where you're only given this option. Then, of course, you can create some alternative ecosystems, you can create spaces of escape from it, but increasingly, for lack of a political agency to reshuffle the global ecosystem of the internet, we risk being thrown into this false choice. And we need to be able to say neither the Silicon Valley monopoly capitalism nor the great firewall of China. But it is very clear to everybody that unless we manage to build a political space that surpasses the borders of the nation state, especially in the European Union, we're not going to be able to even have the political space, the economic capacity of constructing an infrastructure that is able to insert a third alternative between those two equally bad or equally worse choices that we're given. Another very clear topic that tomorrow is going to be discussed in a fantastic lecture by Walter, who is sitting there, is that home is the most important place in the world. And if you produce furniture, it's it's very important that your home is in Luxembourg, because you can only pay 5% taxation on your profit. If you produce toothpastes, it's very important that your home is in the Netherlands, so if you're Procter & Gamble, you can evade all the taxes that we should pay every time we brush our teeth. Well, we pay them, but then they just pocket them and put them on a fiscal paradise. I won't continue very much, because tomorrow there is a beautiful lecture precisely on this issue. But again, it's very clear that the choice that we are being given is a false choice between two equally bad alternatives. We can stay with this system. We can stay with the system where multinational corporations pile up hundreds of billions of tax-evaded cash and bring it through fiscal paradises that are very exotic, you know, like Ireland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, you know, not many palm trees in those fiscal heavens, unfortunately. They're very close. So you can stay stuck with this system where they go through all this and then they end up in some more exotic place like Bermudas, or you are given an option. You can turn your country into a fiscal paradise. That's what Theresa May was threatening to do. This is what increasingly you see happening, a race to the bottom of which country in the European Union can do what used to be called beggar thy neighbor better. Which country can steal other people's taxes by offering a race to the bottom in corporate taxation. It's a very competitive environment. You know, toothpaste, the furniture, the internet technology in Ireland, and you really have to do the best that you've got. Portugal, for instance, Portugal has got Sun, so it's offering pensioners who frankly don't want to spend their retirement in Britain, I mean, I understand them, to go to Portugal and stop paying taxes on their pensions and to pocket a bit more money and enjoy la vida loca in Portugal instead. What that does is that it takes obviously a revenue stream from pensions away from the European states. So again, you have a choice. You can accept that the fiscal heavens exist, or you can turn your country into one. Once more, we think that something better needs to be done. We need to be able to include a third option. It's very simple here. Shut them down and perhaps also have a diplomatic embargo on countries that continue doing unfair taxation competition. But tomorrow, Walter is going to tell you all about it in much more eloquent terms than I could possibly do. The list is very long, but as the god of time or the god of timekeeping would say, etc. You know, one could mention, well, multinational corporations and trade. It's quite obvious to everyone that we dislike a system where H&M and Zara exploit low-paid workforce and pollute rivers in Bangladesh in order to sell us crap at €5. But also the alternative that we're offered of building protectionist walls around our countries. It's frankly a pretty shitty option. And a space such as Europe would have the capacity of pushing through trade deals that would look very different from those that unfortunately it is at the moment trying to push through, or it was, like TTIP and CETA, using the size of its market to reformulate what globalization would actually look like and escape, once again, the false choice between a system of the Zaras and the H&Ms, or the erection of trade barriers and protectionist walls around our countries, which again is not really an option. Climate change is a very clear example that everyone's got in mind, and it is really reassuring to see that there is a new generation of so-called millennials that in every survey demonstrate they have this instinctive awareness that there is so much global interconnectivity that so many of those challenges are just not going to be solvable at the national level, and if we just remain in our own national silos. Very many issues. We don't have the time to go through them, but where does Europe come in? I mean, much of this is global, obviously. You know, if tax havens are a global problem, so is climate change clearly, migration, refugees, the internet. And yet, there is no global politics to speak of yet, let alone a global democratic politics. There is very little you can do if you want to change the global parliament. I mean, there isn't one. There is a space in the United Nations where 5 countries veto each other out every time there is something to be decided. This quote comes from a beautiful film, The Postman, Il Postino, by Massimo Troisi. And in this film, there is a scene where the postman, a small postman in a very small island off the coast of Naples, goes to meet Pablo Neruda, the Chilean poet, who is on exile in the island. And the postman asks to the poet, what is a metaphor, maestro? And today, the understanding that we should be having of Europe is really Europe as a metaphor for the world that we want to construct or that we would want to live in. For at least two reasons. The first is that it's quite clear that if we're not able, in a very politically and economically integrated space, such as the European Union is, I mean, we have a single currency, just to say one, and people in Greece know what this means more than anyone, frankly. If we're not able in a politically and economically monetarily integrated space, such as the European Union, to produce a democratic political space that moves beyond the nation state, well, this will bode very well for any idea of cooperative, democratic, global governance. In a certain sense, what will happen in the future, in the coming years, within the European Union, could be read as a very good metaphor or even prediction for what will happen at global level. The G20 in Hamburg, with the chaos of the authoritarians, with Orbán and Putin, and to some extent Trump, pitted against the liberals that try to maintain things as they are, and Merkel becoming the new leader of the free world, is very similar to the disintegration of the European Union that we are experiencing, where countries are pitted one against the other. Instead of having Putin, you have Kaczynski. It's a smaller scale version of the G20 in Hamburg, what we're actually increasingly witnessing in the European Union. So there is this metaphorical responsibility that we have. We need to be able to make it work in this continent, and if we cannot demonstrate that there exists a democratic politics beyond borders, well, then the future looks like a future of increasingly high walls globally, unfortunately. And at the same time, there is the opportunity that Europe gives as as the world's largest market, frankly. If you are the world's largest market, you can do things when it comes to Google, when it comes to tax havens, that no single country could ever dream of. There is a size that is given to us, and that we are irresponsibly wasting away by being able to seize it politically and use the size of our union as a real force for global change in the years ahead. And God knows how much we need global change in this extraordinarily chaotic new global disorder that is replacing the global order of the Washington consensus. So Europe is a metaphor, and Europe is the place where those of us who live in this part of the world can operate to trigger a systemic change that is close to their house. And once again, in Greece, one knows just how important it is to be able to change the political and economic structures of the European Union, not for some abstract ideal, but just to be able to guarantee a job to your son or daughter, and at the same time to have a change that has an absolutely global aspiration as well. And we go back to the idea of Europa as something that goes beyond the borders of Europe. Europa goes towards the west, she goes towards the east, she goes towards the south. I want to try and wrap it up by saying what should we do to try and get to that stage. Because of course this sounds very nice, let's do a democratic Europe that reins in tax havens, that creates a third digital ecosystem beyond Google and the Great Firewall of China, fantastic. But we all know that the president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, is the person who is responsible for setting up the country he was prime minister of for 15 years, Luxembourg, as a tax haven in the first place. So how do you do this? How can you think? And of course there are many more examples that could be given, and once again I think any Greek in this room can give many more examples than I could, as to how Europe is betraying itself, how democracy is betraying itself, and how certainly Europe is very far away from being the metaphor, or at least the positive metaphor, of the world that we want to see. What I'm increasingly persuaded by is something that has become the motto of a pan-European movement that I gave a hand last year in setting up, which is DiEM25, and they say Europe will be democratized or it will disintegrate. What this means is, think back of Gramsci at the beginning. You live in a situation where, on the one hand, you have the continuation of the status quo, business as usual, and on the other, the morbid symptoms, the monsters. This asynchronic time that I began with history changing and politics failing to change. If we remain like that in the European Union, then the only victors will be the monsters of the Kaczynskis and of the Orbáns. Unless we're able to trigger a significant democratic transformation of the structures of our political union, then the risk that it will disintegrate or that it will become a space where simply one does not want to live is unfortunately a very sincere risk that we're looking at. So the time is really now. The time is now to try and not simply install different policies within the structures, the decision-making structures of the European Union, but to instill a different decision-making structures, to democratize Europe. I don't have the time, and I want to wrap up and close to have a very long discussion of what democracy in Europe would look like, but certainly there is something to be said about innovating democracy. It's not just replicating the national democratic structure that we have at European level. There is a great experimentation to make, and I'm really pleased that there were representatives of cities opening the event tonight, because part of the innovation that we need is an innovation that reconfigures the levels at which democracy operates. It is, for instance, a scandal that so little political space is given to cities when it comes to the refugee welcoming and the relocation of refugees that arrive on the southern shore of the European Union. You have this extraordinary situation where the European Union has agreed on a relocation scheme of the refugees arriving in Greece and Italy to other countries, a situation where some cities, such as Barcelona, for instance, would like to welcome those refugees and give them a decent welcoming in their city space, and in between you have nation states that block the European level agreement and the relocation that the cities of their country themselves would actually like to have. A very clear example is not just Poland or Hungary, it's Spain. Spain is blocking the refugee relocation scheme, while Madrid and Barcelona have big banners that say refugees welcome, and yet they cannot welcome them because the nation state blocks them. So when we speak about democratizing Europe, it's not just having more powers for the European Parliament, it's thinking through how can we reconfigure transnational democracy, transnational politics for the 21st century. And the case of migration is one where it's very clear, as a German politician, Gesine Schwan, actually is advocating, is a space where it's very clear that the relation increasingly has to be one between a transnational dimension, that of the European Union, and a very local dimension, the dimension of cities that have to be empowered in order to make, paradoxically, transnational politics increasingly successful. There could be very many examples. I wanted to mention these of cities to say that when we speak about democratizing Europe, it's not rebuilding the nation state at a super state level. It's really being creative and reimagining what democracy would look like in this newly accelerated historical return. I think we have the space to do it when it comes to the people to do it with. You always hear the idea that there is no such thing as a European demos, blah, 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 blah. What I know is that there might not be one single European demos, one single European people, and thank God, because the idea of ein Volk is one that I would really like to go beyond. But there are many demoi, which is the plural of demos. This quote, Christos, was a Greek activist in Frankfurt during a Blockupy protest, and some German activists went up to him and said, what Germany is doing to Greece is a scandal, you have all our solidarity, we stand in solidarity with you. And Christos responded, fuck off, we don't need your solidarity. You have mini jobs, you have precarity, you are deep in the shit in the system as we are, we don't need you to be in solidarity with us, we need you to join us in a common European struggle to change the social and political deal in our continent. What that really triggered at a very grassroots level was the idea that there are equivalencies of struggle. There is a problem with youth unemployment and precarity that transcends any national dichotomy between core and periphery in our continent, and there is one demos that constitutes itself around such a demand. You have another one when it comes to refugee welcome initiatives, extraordinary initiatives interconnected from the City Plaza Hotel in Athens to the Baobab Center in Rome, the Austrian SOS convoy that goes to get migrants in Hungary in connection with the grassroots initiatives in Central and Eastern Europe. And I could give you hundreds of examples of initiatives of transnational solidarity that I've met over those years. And those are the demoi, the demosis, that we're really looking at when we say that a European republic, a transnational democratic space, is possible. We know that we failed a lot. Beautiful final quote by Samuel Beckett. And the system of European democracy failed the most spectacularly in 2015 in Greece. I was part of the so-called solidarity movement with what was happening here. I was one of those who was making the argument that Greece was not demanding any special treatment for itself. Greece was demanding a new deal when it came to the question of public debt, which is a pan-European question, the question of lack of investments, which is a pan-European question, the question of soaring unemployment, especially among the young, which is a pan-European question, and we spectacularly failed to translate that national struggle in a pan-European struggle by reaching a true mobilization, socially and politically, of this new democratic Europe that we would like to see happening. That perhaps was a trauma for many. It enshrined the idea that Europe cannot change, that the Monday might be spectacular, but Sunday will never end. But we need to fail again, and we need to fail better. One endgame, of course, endgame is also the title of a play by Samuel Beckett, is 2019. 2019 is the next European elections appointment. And I deeply believe, and I'm deeply committed to the idea that by that time we need to have genuine pan-European political forces that contest those elections. Until today, European elections have been a kind of mid-term election for national parties to assess how well they are doing in the national arena. The situation is such, for all that we have been discussing today, the neither nor that we want to stand for, neither Silicon Valley nor the Great Firewall of China, neither fiscal havens nor becoming one, the situation is such that we need a new pan-European political space to be constructed. We need the capacity to rally and mobilize citizens from Portugal to Poland around the idea of a new deal, a new political solution for our continent, one that is able to trigger a genuine transnational participation, a genuine transnational democracy. And the elections in 2019, while it will not be a parliamentary presence in the parliament to solve anything, but the elections in 2019 give us an opportunity to try and imagine something new, something that has never been done before, a genuine, common, pan-European civil society campaign for change that unites citizens all across the continent and brings their voices at the level of the institutions, but also that empowers themselves. We have another Europe. We have it, as Hegel would say, in itself. It exists in the practices of solidarity all across our continent. It does not yet exist for itself. It doesn't have consciousness of its existence. And perhaps 2019 can be an endgame where that transition from the in itself to the for itself can be made to arise. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo.
Thank you. Sorry,
you were really on time if we would have started punctual. So now we're still half an hour late in the program, but that's okay because it's so nice that we have these great discussions here. Lorenzo will be here for your questions, for your discussion with him, and I hope also to see like answers or actions happening that is in this area of topics. So now we will have a short break. We will make it not 15 minutes, but maybe 7 to 10. So I would be really happy to see you all here again in a few minutes, because now it's going about like how we really do make these policies. Do we really make them data-driven, like it's the trend in the past years? Or do we maybe also look more into speculative futures, into how arts, culture, sci-fi can also bring some ideas for new politics or new policies. Also, we're starting the Stage 2 program with online tools for drug counseling, and we also start in the breakout area with online educational topics. So I'm really happy that you're all here. Have a 10-minute break and then come back. Thank you.